The prophet Zechariah was a prophet who, along with the prophet Haggai, encouraged the construction of Zerubbabel's temple, the Second Temple, around 520 BC. He was called by God to become a prophet at a very young age. Around 20 years old, and the visions he saw were too much for him to handle. The book of Zechariah is divided into two main parts: visions and prophecy. The first half of the book is dominated by visions of the building of the temple, while the second half is composed of prophecies about the Messiah. The visions of the temple are Zechariah chapter 1 through 6. Then there are 8 visions, and in the middle of them are the questions about fasting that the people of Bethel asked and the answers. That's Zechariah chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is about fasting. Chapter 8 is a message of restoration. Then there's a prophecy about the symbiosis and the second coming of the Messiah. And that's Zechariah chapter 9 through 14. Today's text is about the prophecies about the Messiah, the second coming of the Messiah. However, there are many prophecies about the Messiah in the book of Zechariah. Among them, there are prophecies about the identity of the Messiah in Zechariah chapter 3, 6, 9, and 13, and then there are prophecies about the symbiosis and passion of the Messiah in Zechariah chapter 9 through 13. There are 3 prophecies concerning the identity of the Messiah. The prophecy of the shoot is found in Zechariah 3, 6. The prophecy of the Messiah as king is found in Zechariah chapter 9. And the prophecy of the shepherd is found in Zechariah chapter 13. Meanwhile, here's how Zechariah compares to Revelation. Zechariah's first vision in Zechariah chapter 1 of red, purple, and white horses. Andi's 8th vision in Zechariah 6 of red, white, black, and colored horses, are similar to the riders of the 4 types of horses in Revelation 6 white, red, black, and blue-yellow horses. Zechariah's second vision, the prophecy of the 4 horns, also serves as a backdrop for Thetan horns. In Revelation chapter 12, 13, and 17, the horns symbolize the powers of the world. Zechariah's third vision, of a boy with a measuring tape, Zechariah 2, resembles the Apostle John measuring the temple of God in Revelation chapter 11. And Zechariah's 5th vision, of 7 pure golden lampstands and 2 olive trees, connects to the 7 golden candlesticks and 7 churches of Asia Minor in Revelation 1-3. Notably, the 2 olive trees are the replenishment of oil for the 7 churches, and the book of Zechariah refers to Joshua, the priest, and Zerubbabel, who are characterized as kings, while in Revelation 11 we see that the 2 olive trees foreshadow Moses, the representative of the Old Testament law, and Elijah, the representative of the prophets, as 2 witnesses and 2 prophets. Then, Zechariah's 6th vision of the flying scroll is very much related to the scrolls of Revelation chapter 5 and 10. As they have all sorts of curses written on the inside and outside of them, which are a record of things to come in the end times. Finally, we see that the words of Zechariah 14 refer to the war of Armageddon of Revelation chapter 19. From today's text Zechariah chapter 12 to the last 14 chapters, we can say that Zechariah is a prophecy of the second coming of the Messiah. More precisely, it's the second coming of Christ. God's promises are God's promises to God's people. Zechariah chapter 12 is the protection of Jerusalem, Zechariah 13 is the cleansing of Jerusalem, and finally Zechariah chapter 14 is the glorification of Jerusalem. But we shouldn't think of Jerusalem as just the city of Jerusalem, which is the capital of Israel. Jerusalem is a symbol, it is a symbol of the people of God. The promise to protect Jerusalem is a promise to protect the people of Israel. It's a promise of purification and glory to the people of God. It's a symbol of the people of God, and Jerusalem is furthermore and ultimately a symbol of the church. So the promise of the protection of Jerusalem is a promise of the protection of the church. And the promise of the purification of Jerusalem is a promise of the purification of the church. First, it predicts that there will be great tribulation in the last days. However, God will protect his saved elect people by his sovereign work. God sovereignly protects us in the time of end-time calamities and tribulation. In verse 2 of our text, it says, "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling." Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. It has been the traditional interpretation of Catholics and Protestants since Augustine that Jerusalem here refers to the Lord's spiritually saved people, so that the church, the believing saints, will be surrounded and attacked by the world in the last days. However, the Jews view this verse as referring to the Jews themselves. Whether you interpret Jerusalem spiritually, as in Christian believers or the church, or literally, as in Israel, can make a huge difference in your interpretation of the end times situation. However, it is possible to have both interpretations at the same time. However, the idea of interpreting this text is completely irrelevant to the Jews. Less convincing in light of the events of today. If there is one place where the world's attention is most focused right now, it is Israel. The current war between Israel and Hamas, which began on October 7, 2023, with the invasion of Hamas, makes it even more clear that it is difficult to exclude Israel from Zechariah's prophecy. However, Christianity is either indifferent to Israel or fails to connect it to biblical prophecy. The reason for this can be traced To the influence of Israeli replacement theology. After the state of Israel was destroyed by the Roman Empire in 70 AD and scattered around the world, the Roman Catholics established a system of Israelite replacement theology, with Augustine at the center of it. The Protestants, influenced by Roman Catholicism, would not escape the theology that replaced Israel with the Church. And even Martin Luther and Calvin, who started the Reformation, would not escape the influence of replacement theology. Replacement theology teaches that Israel has been abandoned by God, and replaced by the Church, so that all of God's promised inheritance is now given to the Church, which is spiritual Israel. The problem with this replacement theology is that, contrary to what the Bible teaches, it has turned all of the end-time prophecies about Israel into symbols for the Church, by making us believe that there is no longer a nation of Israel in God's plan. This is why the prophetic words about Israel in Isaiah, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelation, and many other prophetic books have been interpreted symbolically, by replacing Israel with the Church. So what does the Bible say about the nation of Israel? Does it say that they are an abandoned people, and that the Gentile churches have replaced them? In Leviticus chapter 26:44, it says, "Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or abhor them so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am the Lord their God." And in 1 Kings chapter 6:13, "And I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel. So I will not utterly destroy Israel, nor forsake them." After being scattered throughout the world, God said that He would gather Israel back to Canaan. In Ezekiel 28:25, this is what the sovereign Lord says. "When I gather the people of Israel from the nations where they have been scattered, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of the nations. Then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob." These words were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity, and are fulfilled in our day. In 1948, Israel was miraculously re-established by the League of Nations, and millions of Israelis who returned to their homeland now live there. At this point, it seems that the replacement theology that replaces Zechariah's prophesied Israel with the Church needs to be reconsidered. The problem with replacement theology is that it interprets the Israel of Zechariah's prophecy as a symbol, not the actual Israel, and sees it as the Gentile Church. This makes verse 3 a difficult passage. "On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." This is another symbolic, abstract interpretation, which in turn blinds us to the prophetic fulfillments that mark Jesus' second coming and makes the situation of the nation of Israel irrelevant to us. However, the Apostle Paul makes it clear what Israel has to do with salvation in the Gospel. Romans chapter 11:1. "I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham, from the tribe of Benjamin." Romans chapter 11:11. "Again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious." Romans chapter 11:24. "After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature, were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?" When we take a literal view of Israel in Zechariah's prophecy, free from the influence of replacement theology, we see a literal fulfillment of the prophecy in the esoteric passage. And Paul makes it clear that we are the ones who have been grafted in. Second, God helps his chosen people to prevail in the midst of tribulation. With the current conflict between Hamas and Israel, the issue of Israel has become a cup of intoxication for all nations on all sides, and a heavy stone for all the nations of the world. These are events that seem to be a prelude to the fulfillment of verses 2:3 of today's text. "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling." Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. 3. "On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." The current conflict between Palestinian Hamas and Israel in the Middle East is directly related to Israel's Third Temple. Hamas's attack on Israelis also an event on the way to the Third Temple, and the Third Temple is directly connected to the second coming of Jesus. The Third Temple is the temple that will be built in Jerusalem during the Church Age, the end of the Gentile times and the last remnant of the Jewish people during the 7-year tribulation. The Bible speaks of a Jewish Third Temple. Jesus said Matthew chapter 24:15, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." Jesus said of Daniel, Daniel 9:27, "Ahe will confirm a covenant with many for 1:7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple J he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him." Paul said that the Antichrist sits in the temple and says he is God. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2:4, "He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God, or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God." The book of Revelation also says that the holy city will be trampled on for 42 months, which means 3.5 years. Revelation chapter 11 too, but exclude the outer court, do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. For these prophecies to be fulfilled, there must be a temple, so there will be a third temple. The third temple refers to the Jewish temple that will be built in Jerusalem at the end of the Gentile times and the Jewish remnant during the 7-year tribulation. There are 3 pillars that support Judaism. They are circumcision, the Torah, and the temple. Circumcision is the ritual by which the people of Israel join the Abrahamic covenant. Jews believe that they are saved by joining the Abrahamic covenant. The Torah is the proof that the people of Israel are God's chosen people according to the Sinai covenant. In other words, the Torah is the standard by which the circumcised descendants of Abraham live before God. And the temple is the place of God's presence with Israel, the sanctuary where atonement is made. But right now, Jews are missing one of the 3 pillars. The temple is the place where Jews offer sacrifices and receive forgiveness for their sins. And they can't sleep at night knowing that they have nowhere to go to make atonement. That's why for 2,000 years, Jews wanted so badly to return to the land of Israel. Every year, when they celebrate the high holidays, they say, next year in Jerusalem. And now their wish is finally coming true. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel is established with the help of the League of Nations in the land of Israel, and in the Six-Day War of 1967. They drive out the Jordanian army and reclaim the Temple Mount. And the Jews are ready to build the temple. They have the temple plans, the building materials, the altar of burnt offering, and all the priests, including the high priest, and the Levites who will be in charge of the temple service. But the Jews still can't build the temple because of 2 Muslim mosques on the Temple Mount, the Temple of Omar, which is the Golden Dome, and the Aqsa Mosque, which claims to be where Muhammad ascended to heaven. If the Jews were to demolish either of those mosques to build their own temple, it would be a war, and it would be a religious war that would only end when both Judaism and Islam are wiped out. In response to the Hamas raid, the leader of Hamas claimed that it was in defense of the Aqsa Mosque, and that it was part of preventing Israel's attempt to rebuild the Third Temple, which was supported by the Islamic world. However, recent archaeological excavations of the ancient city of Jerusalem have revealed that the Temple Mount, where the current mosques stand, was once the Roman army's Antonia fortress, and that the Israeli temple was located 600 meters south of the Temple Mount. And the Israeli Sanhedrin has accepted this evidence. And the Sanhedrin then went so far as to ask Trump and Putin to be the next Cyruses. They embarked on rebuilding the temple and received a positive response. The building of the temple could become a rallying cry to resolve the conflict between Judaism and Islam and bring peace to the Middle East. The problem is setting the tone. With the current tensions and war weariness on both sides, a new leader could emerge to resolve the issue and make it more likely that the third temple at Jesus' return could become a reality. Third, God protects and strengthens the weak so that they can overcome the world and their enemies. In that day, the day of the end, God says he will provide special protection for his chosen people. From chapter 12 Zechariah to the last 14 chapters, the phrase "in that day" is used frequently. In that day appears in today's text verses 3, 6, 8, and 9, and again later in the book. In that day refers to the day of Jesus' return as the day of victory for believers. It's also the day when those who oppose God and his kingdom will be judged. And in the midst of that judgment, God promises to protect his people. So, especially in Zechariah chapter 12, the word protection is used a lot. In verse 8 of today's text, it says, "On that day the Lord will shield those who live in Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them." In verses 1 through 9, it promises environmental protection, and in verses 10 through 14, it promises internal protection, spiritual protection. In verse 1, we read, "The Lord, who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth, and who forms the human spirit within a person," declares here, God is both the creator of the heavens and the earth and the creator of man's heart. God is the creator of the heavens and the earth. He is the owner of the environment. At the same time, what kind of God is that God? The God who created the heart in man, that is, the owner of our souls. Therefore, God is the one who protects our environment and protects our hearts. God protects the inhabitants of Jerusalem and says that the Gentile nations that come against Jerusalem will be destroyed on that day. In verses 7, 8, 9, we read, "The Lord will save the dwellings of Judah first, so that the honor of the house of David and of Jerusalem's inhabitants may not be greater than that of Judah. 8 On that day the Lord will shield those who live in Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. 9 On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem." God is the one who will protect his chosen people, environmentally during the tribulation and persecution of the end times, and he will also protect their souls for eternity. In verses 4, 5, we are told that God will strike down all the words of the enemy and make them astonished, so that the leaders of Judah will say that they have strength from the Lord, the God of hosts. In verse 6, we are also told that the leaders of Judah will be like a furnace and a torch. And they will burn all the nations on the right and left of them, and the people of Jerusalem will live in Jerusalem again, in their own city. Today's text tells us that God, the author of history, will judge the nations that invaded Jerusalem. Because the city of Jerusalem, the nation of Israel, is a small and insignificant nation, the nations around it will gather to take it. They will drink it in one gulp, but they will be drunk and stagger. They will lift it up to throw it away, but it will be heavy and they will be greatly injured. Because the city of Jerusalem looks like a small and weak city to the invaders, and a nation that can be easily conquered. It will never fall because it is a nation that God protects and a people that God cares for. This is the same with the church's relationship with the world. The church and Christians will always be weak in comparison to the world. So in the battle between the church and the world, at first glance, the church always seems to lose. But the church of God wins in the end, because the spirit of God is at work, as it says, it is not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. Nevertheless, many churches today have been swept away by secularism and materialism, and have lost the glory that God has given to the church. We must therefore fight the right spiritual battles, as Paul exhorts in Ephesians chapter 6. 12 inches for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Like David against Goliath, we must rely solely on the name of the Lord God of hosts, and He will fight on our behalf and give us victory. So in verse 9 of today's passage, we read, "On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem." May you live in this protection of the Lord.